Thanks for having me. It's really great to give a talk to this research group. And I have two things for this talk. One, to hopefully provide a useful theoretical perspective for you and your own research. And second, to learn at least as much from you as you learn from me, because obviously a lot of you have extensive expertise in relevant areas. Okay, so I'll get going. Title of my talk is But Extremists, right? So what is that about? Basically, it's this talk is going to answer an objection that has been leveled against my research in the past and hopefully answer it convincingly. So let's start with a quotation. All right, great. So, hard though it may be for the godless to accept, some people really do believe in a 6-day creation or in 72 virgins awaiting them in paradise. It is precisely because such heartfelt beliefs motivate behavior, e.g., suicide bombing, that we cannot bring ourselves to believe in belief in the Dennetian sense. Religions are not just harmless tissues of quasi-fictional credences safely combined within a special compartment of the mind, never to leak into the real world. By and large, they consist of factual claims about the nature of the universe, endorsed and acted upon by millions. We ignore the reality of such convictions at our own peril. Martin Boudry and Jerry Coyne from a paper discussing my work in 2016. And the thing that they're criticizing is suggested by the title of my book, namely that I think a great many religious beliefs in terms of their psychological dynamics are essentially imaginings of the sort that guy make-believe play, albeit imaginings, as I'll talk about later, that activate sacred values and are constitutive of group identity, right? So they are essentially saying, well, Van Leeuwen must be wrong because extremists, right? Now, I've responded to one aspect of this in the past, so just focus on the things highlighted in orange. One, perhaps the most objectionable aspect of this quote is they slide from talking about the psychology of real extremists to the psychology of millions, right? So in any given year, and this is what I pointed out in my response piece, you'll get on the order of 500 or so suicide bombings worldwide. And then they're treating that in the second highlighted in orange bit as something that's representative of religious believers at large. So that's a mistake. But what I want to focus on in this talk is what I think is the earlier mistake, where if you look at the motivation of behavior, the suicide bombing, right? It's presenting that extremist behavior as if it's merely an instance of instrumental rationality, right? So terrorist wants to have sex with 72 virgins. Terrorist has a factual belief that suicide bombing will be the correct means to achieve this. And in good rational order, what does terrorists do? Engages in an act of suicide bombing. Well, for various reasons, probably that everyone here will understand, that's a grossly simplistic picture of what's going on. But as I understand it, that's the picture that was presented by Boudry and Coyne in the response piece. All right. So it's essentially that part, the first part highlighted in orange, that I want to take apart today and do so in a way that kind of incorporates my broader framework. So here's the outline. So we've already done it, a quotation to get us started. What I'm going to do next is just give a summary of my two-map view of belief, factual belief versus religious credence. And this is something of a précis of a lot of the work in my book. So kind of to give you the most up-to-date version of what it is that the perspective just talked about was criticizing. And then I'll present a more formal version of that argument, right? So I'm going to clean it up, give what I think is a better version of the argument that they were making, and then I'm going to respond to it, and I'm going to highlight two possible responses, right? Because it's worth distinguishing different models of what's going on in the mind of the extremists. And then I'm going to argue for reasons for thinking why the evidence tilts in the direction of saying that, well, this construct that I've developed of religious credence, it doesn't just apply to ordinary religious believers. It also is useful in characterizing the minds of extremists as well. One, because extremists are also capable of hypocrisy. And then two, if you look at the symbolic aspects of extremist action, I think it's better accounted for by the religion as make-believe model than a simple instrumental rationality model of the sort that's implied in the Boolean coin flip. So that's where we're going, and then I'll wrap it up with kind of a big picture perspective. And if anyone wants to stop me and ask for clarifications along the way, go right ahead. All right, so let's jump in. All right. First of all, what are the main theses of this talk, right? So just to have something to kind of have as our goalposts. Thesis one, the extremist argument fails. All right, so fairly straightforward. I'm going to show what the flaw is with it. And then two, much extremist behavior is consistent with and better explained by the religious credence view. All right, and that's going to be more of a convergence of evidence argument than a straightforward the logic fails kind of argument. Okay, so what is this two-map view of belief that I've developed in my book and other places? Well, I'll start with the story. So when I was in first grade, there was a group of boys that played G.I. Joe with G.I. Joe toys on the playground at Oakdale Christian School in Grand Rapids, Michigan. We would meet every playground recess period underneath this wooden playground structure. So this is not the actual picture of it, but there's a shady place in the sand under the wooden playground structure where we would meet and we would play with these invisible supernatural agents, right? So one can see that in this case, there was interaction with invisible supernatural agents. It was done in a designated time, in a designated place, which was sort of sacred to us. And importantly, it was something of an in-group. So people who did not have the right kind of toys, if they didn't have G.I. Joe toys, they didn't get to play with us, right? So you had to be serious about playing the right kind of game. And importantly, if you look at the psychology of this pretend play, it involves what I call a two-map cognitive structure. So we had our ordinary factual beliefs about where we were. We were on the playground with sand. There were piles of sand and so on. But then we also had a layer of imagining, which was superimposed over the factual belief layer, where the piles of sand were, say, fortresses, and these plastic dolls were actually superheroes, and so on and so forth. So this characterizes a lot of pretend play, and I want to reiterate both it engendered an in-group and it involved this two-map cognitive structure. Well, at that same time in my life, my family were also members of First Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And in First Christian Reformed Church, we also interacted with invisible super agents, right? And we did so in a shady place, as you can see, designated time and place and confines and so forth. And this certainly formed something of an in-group, a Calvinist in-group. And as I argue in my book, very much of the time, there was also something like a two-map cognitive structure, where there was the map layer in our minds that represented the supernatural agents, actions, and events. And then there was the sort of mundane factual belief layer. All right. And those are sort of some interesting suggestive parallels. I'm not presenting this as an argument, but sort of the make-believe play, you can see it has the elements of a paradigm for also possibly understanding a lot of religious cognition and activity. So if this is maybe what I hope is the most influential slide of the talk. And it's really just a question, right? So thinking about the sort of thing that the comparison we just saw, I think it raises the following question. To what extent are the cognitive structures that guide religious practice the same as those that guide make-believe play? All right. So this is what I hope everyone meditates on, even if you disagree with my answers to it. I think this is a question very much worth meditating on. And I have some people who agree with me on that. Like Ingela Visuri and Tanya Lerman have a similar kind of question in the background of their own research. So there's some commonalities there. All right. So what do I say to this? Well, I've gestured at it already. But more officially, here's the two-map view of belief. So first, I make a fairly kind of simple ground-clearing linguistic point, which I think will help unsow a lot of confusion. Belief and parallels in other languages is polysemous, right? Or polysemous, people say it differently. That means the word itself can have a number of related but distinct referents, right? So right away, if you find yourself asking, like Boudry and Coyne do, oh, is it really a belief? You're just replicating a certain amount of ambiguity that a good theory in philosophy and psychology should be in the business of dispelling, right? So a parallel to belief, we can think of jade. So jade, it turns out, it is actually two different natural kinds, jadeite and nephrite. So the pre-theoretic term isn't of service in downstream scientific investigation. So what one needs to do, rather, is fashion terms of art for talking about the actual scientific kinds. And I think when we're doing sort of cognitive psychology and then also philosophy of mind, we should be in the business of similar sorts of projects. All right, so here are the ways I formulate my main theses in my book. And again, this will be kind of in the background. So my distinct attitudes thesis is that factual belief and religious credence both exist and are distinct cognitive attitudes. So distinct ways of processing ideas. So I'm not defining these terms by way of their contents, but rather I'm postulating that there are different ways that we can relate to ideas, right? And these are two ones that are very important and should not be conflated. All right. The second and perhaps more controversial thesis is not just that religious credence is different from factual belief, but rather that, as I suggested before, the way religious credence differs from factual belief is much the same, is in many of the same fundamental ways that fictional imagining does, where by fictional imagining, I mean the cognitive attitude that underlies and guides a lot of Ken play. All right. So, and we're going to go into those differences in just a moment. But just to get us focused on this, what I call attitude dimension of mental states, let's just do a little exercise. So here's a question for you. Let's take this, so Jade is back. Let's take this fill in the blank. Jade has some cognitive attitude toward the proposition that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Now, would this be a religious credence or a factual belief?
Factual belief, yeah.
Trick question. It could be either, right? That's the whole point. That's the whole point. I'm surprised you fell for it, Jeroen. I mean, you're supposed to be good at this stuff. All right. I'll leave you alone. I'll leave you alone. No, I set you up. It was a trick question, but really, the important thing about the attitude content distinction is that for any given idea, be it a religious idea or a matter of fact idea or whatever, there are different ways we could relate to it. So if Jade were an historian, Jade could hypothesize that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, and that could guide her historical research. Jade might hope that Jesus was born in Bethlehem for whatever reason. Jade might, in some sense, believe, and again, that word needs to be disambiguated, that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And Jade might, matter of fact, think that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And these would all be different ways that Jade could relate to the same idea. And importantly, what I'm arguing is that religious credence and factual belief are attitude types. So I think there's a sort of content centrism, at least in the field of philosophy, where people tend to focus obsessively almost on characterizing the content of mental states while overlooking this attitude dimension. All right, let me point out one other consequence of my framework and of this attitude content distinction, and it's the following. Religious credences needn't have necessarily religious content, right? It's a psychological possibility that one has a religious credence type attitude, say to the idea that the 2020 election was stolen, right? Or something like that, just to give a very provocative example, right? And that would be a different kind of mental state with different cognitive dynamics from a factual belief with the same content, right? And at the same time, it is in principle possible for there to be factual beliefs with religious contents, like maybe that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. All right, so kind of one of the virtues of my approach is that it has the expressive power to capture commonalities, say, between the religious and the political ways of processing ideas, right? So think of when you see religious credence, think more of like the adverb religiously, as opposed to something like supernatural contents, right? That's not an intrinsic part of the idea. All right, although that attitude commonly does go with those sorts of contents. All right, so you're next going to ask, well, what what is the difference between religious credence and factual belief. And here I'll just give kind of a summary. So in the book, I develop a lot of evidence for seeing things these ways. But essentially, there's a conceptual component, and then there's an empirical component. The conceptual component is capturing the difference between what we would call, or I call, factual belief and imagining. So answering Hume's question of wherein consists the difference between fiction and belief, whereby fiction he meant something like the attitude of imagining things. All right. So any good psychology will have to have the resources for cashing out that distinction, right? That's the conceptual part. And the empirical part is saying, well, once you have that framework in hand, you can apply it to a lot of data from the cognitive sciences of religion and history of religion and so on and so forth, and say, well, where do a lot of religious beliefs fall once we've made that distinction clear? All right, so let me give a rough overview of what I think the difference between factual belief and imagining is. So first of all, and Rick can tell you more about this than I, but factual belief is involuntary, right, to a large extent. So for example, you can't just decide to believe factually that today is Saturday. If I gave you $1 million, you might pretend to believe it, but I can't just get you to voluntarily factually believe something that strikes you as untrue. And this is characteristic of factual. Second, the attitude of factual belief is uncompartmentalized. What I mean by that is whenever you're acting in the world, your broad class of factual beliefs are involved in guiding behavior, right? So for an example, even if you're on the stage pretending that you're on a beach, you're still going to avoid the trap door so you don't fall through it, right? So even the actor who is imagining that there's just a beach there also has a layer of factual belief that's keeping track of what the world is like in any given setting, whether the play is going on or not. All right, so that's just one illustration of uncompartmentalization, right? Factual beliefs are always operative, guiding in the background, so that when they're relevant, they're used in guiding behavior, even if you're pretending something to the contrary. All right, so that's uncompartmentalization. Second, factual beliefs have widespread cognitive governance. All right, what that means is you use them in drawing inferences from one representational state to another. So for example, if you imagine lightning striking a tree, you're going to imagine the tree getting hot, getting charred, maybe catching on fire. And that's because your factual beliefs guide inferences among your imaginings. Factual beliefs about wood, about lightning, and so on and so forth. All right, so there's this kind of cognitive governance. Factual beliefs provide essentially a reservoir to be drawn upon in drawing inferences from one attitude to another, whether they're factual beliefs or something altogether, different altogether. Finally, factual beliefs are evidentially vulnerable. If you factually believe that P and you cognize evidence strongly contrary to P, you're going to have an involuntary tendency for that factual belief to be extinguished. And note, I'm focusing on extinction conditions rather than formation conditions, because lots of different attitude types can be formed consistently with evidence, but is evidence sort of decisive in undermining the attitude type? That's what makes factual beliefs different from imaginings, right? And which have the contrary properties, which we can go through a little bit more quickly. So imagining is largely a voluntary kind of mental state. You can choose to imagine that there's a cat walking around on this table. It's compartmentalized. It tends to guide behavior in particular practical settings like make-believe play or practice, but then lie dormant with respect to guiding behavior. Otherwise, it's inferentially curtailed. If you're imagining that P, you don't use that imagining to draw inferences among your factual beliefs. Otherwise, you would end up factually believing everything you imagine, and it would collapse. And then finally, imagining is not evidentially vulnerable. You can imagine contrary to the evidence all that you like. All right, so this is in my own way a kind of development of a lot of standard moves that get made in the philosophy of imagination literature. I think I do it more systematically, but this is going to be broadly it's not too controversial picture, right, of what differentiates factual belief from imagining. Well, if we look at a lot of religious beliefs and looking, say, at the anthropology of Christianity, we'll see that there's a lot of voluntariness to religious belief, a lot of choice getting put into the picture. right? So people say, I choose to believe, right? Okay. And there's also evidence from the sociology of religion, which I won't canvass. All right. Religious beliefs appear to be, in many ways, compartmentalized, right? So we all know the phrase once a week Christian, and that would just be one illustration of the compartmentalization of what I will now call religious credence. Inferential curtailment, various experiments that have been done suggest that oftentimes people don't draw inferences that would follow from what they claim as their religious beliefs. Okay, and then not only is it the case that many religious beliefs are not extinguished by evidence, but it's a virtue that they're not, right? So one believes on faith and so on and so forth. Now, note, again, this is an existential claim. So I'm not claiming that everything that we would pre-theoretically call a religious belief has these four characteristics, only that many religious beliefs do. And insofar as that's the case, it deserves its own kind of category separate from factual belief and more akin to imagining, right? So we should take the existence of this mental state type seriously, noting the attitude content distinction, right? So again, not every mental state that has religious contents is going to have these processing features that I put under religious beliefs, but insofar as many of them do, we need to posit a different kind of mental state. Well, this is going to raise the question, and for many people it does raise the question, well, what, it seems like religious belief is so much more serious than make-believe play. On the one hand, I think that underestimates the seriousness of a lot of commitment to make-believe play, right? It's, fiction and pretending is extremely important to most people, but there is something that I have to say here, and it's like in trying to conflate religious beliefs with factual beliefs, it's putting the seriousness of them in the wrong place. So instead of thinking that religious credences are factual beliefs, we should maintain, for reasons that I've just given, that they are a form of imagining, but an imagination type that is definitive of group identity, right? So it's like, which imaginings are you committed to acting on, albeit in a compartmentalized way, that determines what group you belong to and who your imagined kin are. All right, and then second, your religious credences categorize events, entities, and other objects and properties and behaviors and so on in the world as something to which your sacred values system attaches, right? So I dedicate a chapter in my book to discussing the nature of sacred values and how they're different from ordinary utilitarian values. But without going into all the specifics, sacred value involves treating something as inviolable. And Philip Tetlock, the psychologist, has a great metaphor for this. It's as if there's people have an intuitive economist living inside their brains and also an intuitive moralist theologian living in their brains, and they don't operate in the same way, right? So for the economist, anything is in principle exchangeable for enough of anything else, and the moralist theologian doesn't value in those terms. All right. So religious credence is extremely serious. I always take exception when people say, "Oh, Van Leeuwen is saying that religious credences are mere imaginings." Well, one, again, that underestimates the power of imagining, and two, it misses that it's a different kind of seriousness that attaches. All right, so that's the broad summary of my view. And now we can return to the question of, well, how well does it deal with the phenomenon of extremism, which again, I'd like to hear more from you about in the Q&A. So let's go on and we'll look at the formalization of this extremist argument. And this can be canvassed in pretty short terms. All right, so let's jump right into it. So what were my critics saying if we neaten it up a little bit? It'll go something like this. Religious extremists have some cognitive attitude toward the religious stories and doctrines of their respective religions. All right, that's a fairly straightforward premise. Second, almost definitional, religious extremists perform violent actions, and let's make violent broadly construed, so not necessarily physical violence, but they do far out things that are expressive of the stories and doctrines referred to in one. All right, fair enough. Three, Nobody would perform violent actions that are expressive of their religious stories and doctrines unless they factually believed them and were correspondingly motivated to said actions by said factual beliefs. All right, so that's the key premise, right? That's the key premise. And then if you have all three of those premises, then you would get something like religious extremists factually believe the stories and doctrines of their religions and are motivated to their violent actions by said factual beliefs. All right, so this is, I think, a neater, more cleaned up version of what was going on in that in point quote, interpreted as charitably as I can. All right, so what do I want to say to this? Well, I've got two possible responses. One is kind of what I conceded in my earlier response piece in 2016, which would go something like the factual belief response, and would be this. While non-extremists typically have religious credence in their religious stories and doctrines, extremists factually believe their religious stories and doctrines, and this difference explains why the latter are more violent. All right, so I could say this, but it would be kind of consistent with my view, but I actually think it's not true. It amounts to a weakening of my view, and I also think now I don't think it's true, right? So now I would want to say something more like this. Extremists, in many cases, have religious credence in their stories and doctrines, so religious credence in terms of the mental state that I just characterized, which explains why their religious behavior is also compartmentalized. But the symbolic actions that express their religious credences are far more violent due to in-group dynamics. All right. So this is what I'm going to say the evidence tilts in favor of. But first, let's deal with the question of, well, why not accept the factual belief view? All right. First of all, we can point out that it's straightforwardly undermotivated. All right. And premise 3, the one that says nobody would engage in such violent actions unless they factually believe their stories and doctrines, it's just question begging. And I think it's false. People engage in violent actions for many reasons. So, for example, perceived humiliation of or threat to one's in-group. So people do violence to outsiders all the time, whether or not they factually believe their professed stories and doctrines, right? And so a big influence on me here, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is Scott Atran's book, Talking to the Enemy. And while it may be the case that the extension of your imagined kin is partly determined by who shares your religious credences, one is not instrumentally acting on religious credences, but rather one is acting in a sort of protective way towards one's in-group. All right, so we don't need premise 3. So the factual belief view that I just canvassed is undermotivated. Second, I think it's also motivated by too narrow a focus, and I think this is something that comes out in the Boudry Coin piece, and it ignores what extremists do with the rest of their time, right? So if you only look at what extremists are doing when they're blowing things up or killing people or whatever, you're going to have a very misleading portrait of their psychology. And this is an important lesson for psychology of religion in general. Evans Pritchard, the great anthropologist, in his book Theories of Primitive Religions, typo there, it says religious, it should say religions. He pointed out this mistake that was made in a lot of 19th century anthropology, where what anthropologists would do then is just not go into the field themselves, but receive reports from travelers who had been various places. And Pritchard is pointing out that a lot of theories of religion make mistakes because what the travelers liked to put on paper was what struck them as crude, curious, and sensational. Magic, barbaric religious rites, superstitious beliefs took precedence over the daily empirical humdrum routines, which comprise 9/10 of the life of primitive man and are his chief interest and concern, right? And so if you look at only the crude, the curious, and the sensational, and you ignore 9/10 of what people do, whether, taking vegetables or shopping or whatever, you're gonna have a misleading portrait of them and the nature of their religious commitments. All right, so I'm going to get into that a little bit more, but again, it shows that the premise 3, which I'm taking exception to, is motivated by a distorted perspective. Okay, third, I think the factual belief view, right, as a response to this extremist argument, it mistakes symbolic action for instrumentally rational action. All right, so here's another quote that kind of highlights that difference. Mark Chaves, a sociologist of religion, has this great article called Rain Dances in the Dry Season, where he develops this notion of the religious congruence fallacy, right? And that's the fallacy of expecting people to behave in ways that are logically coherent with their beliefs. I would put it as expecting people to behave as if they factually believed their religious credences. And he points out, people all the time pray for health or wealth or victory in battle. And such instrumental looking religious action may look like dancing for rain in the dry season. But the fact that such action almost always supplements rather than replaces practical action shows otherwise. All right. So it's very easy at a superficial glance to mistake instrumental looking action, symbolic action for instrumental action because it has the same broad form. All right. So I think that's partly what's going on with the factual belief model. All right, this mistake. Okay, so this is going back to the two theses I laid out at the beginning. I think this is sufficient for saying, look, this extremist argument, it simply fails. All right. But it still remains to me to say a little bit more about why I think we should accept the religious credence model, even for extremists, or at least a broad range of them, admitting that there's always going to be variation among communities and individuals. All right, so of the two possible responses, we saw the factual belief response was undermotivated. It concedes too much. Now let's talk a little bit more about why I think that the religious credence response is a little bit better. So again, that would say extremists in many cases do have religious credence in their religious stories and doctrines, which explains their religious behavior, why their religious behavior is also compartmentalized, but the symbolic actions that express their religious credences are far more violent due to in-group dynamic. Okay, so these are going to be very suggestive arguments without being conclusive, but I think they have something to them. So argument 1 for why accepting the religious credence model is just going to point out the fact that, well, extremists are also capable of hypocrisy. And I'll give a few examples of that. So some of you might know the book by Tara Westover called Educated. Does anyone know that here? It's a fascinating book. So in short, her family is a survivalist Mormon family in Idaho. Basically means they're preparing for end times very soon. Her father was, the patriarch in a very literal sense in the family, cut them off largely from society. She managed to escape, go to university, and then eventually become a historian, and wrote this memoir, Educated. And one of the characteristics of this extremist father was he was constantly vilifying hospitals as agents of the government, as places of Satan, right? And when one is sick, one does not go to the hospital, right? Because the hospital is this place of Satan. However, there's a very memorable place in the book where she points out when one of her brothers had a very severe life-threatening accident, the father actually brought the son to the hospital when the need was dire. All right. Now, there were other accidents that happened, like the father got very severely burned and he didn't go to the hospital, and he sort of was praised as a hero for not doing so, which has its own funny dynamics, right? Because it would just be the sensible thing if you thought, why would, if you're burned, why would you go to the place of Satan, right? So, but I think more sharply, the fact that he brought his son to the hospital is quite telling, right? He's not acting congruently with his claimed religious credences. So that's one example. From Scott Atran's book, his guide, Farhan, who is an Indonesian Muslim terrorist, in his off time, he would attempt to sleep with Christian women. When he was not working, And Atran kind of describes he would put cologne on and slick his hair back and go out. So this is an example of not acting as you would if you were always acting consistently with your religious beliefs. So there's compartmentalization there too. Ted Haggard, an anti-gay evangelical preacher, was caught buying crystal meth in the United States. You may have heard this story. I don't know if it made it over to no. Well, look Ted Haggard up. This happened.
Yeah. I'm afraid it didn't make it over.
It did. It did. Okay. Well, at least you're informed, right? Okay. So he was caught buying crystal meth from a male prostitute. All right. Moving along, the Madrid bombers that Atran also discussed were drug dealers who would smoke and drink in their daily life, but they also performed extreme actions in the name of their religion. And so the point being is simply that there's, I say hypocrisy here, but it's really all instances of the sort of compartmentalization that I think is very common in cases of the religiously devout. All right. So hypocrisy, this is going to be a very rough and ready definition of hypocrisy, is a matter of engaging in behavior that would be damaging to one's values if one's avowed beliefs were actually true. All right. So the sorts of behaviors that would only be non-damaging if the beliefs weren't true, those are going to be hypocritical behaviors. All right. So the claim here is that and this is an empirical conjecture, right? The factual belief view, so the one that I'm sort of dismissing, that makes the following kind of prediction. And this is a big, messy empirical prediction, who knows how to investigate it. It's something like this, that extremists would engage in less hypocrisy than non-extremists, right? Because if you simply straightforwardly factually believed that God is always watching, one would act in accordance with that more, with exceptions for weakness of will, than if one had a compartmentalized religious creeds. All right, so the religious credence view is going to predict that extremists and non-extremists differ little in their levels of hypocrisy, or perhaps maybe extremists are even more hypocritical on average due to their more vitriolic assertion of their religious credences. All right, so my conjecture here is, of course, that something like this prediction will be true in the long run. And the examples that I just gave are kind of tip of the iceberg of evidence that would be relevant to evaluating that. But insofar, I can say this, insofar as this prediction strikes one as plausible, that is something to be said in favor of the religious credence view as a model, not just of ordinary lay people, religious minds, but also of the extremist minds. Okay. Second, and I'll wrap up pretty soon here. The second argument for the religious credence view does appeal to the symbolic aspects of extremist action. And I'm going to borrow an argument from Emil Durkheim, who's a great influence on me. He wrote this book published in 1912 called The Elementary Forms of Religious Life. And it focused on essentially totem religion among Aboriginal Australians at the time, and where he basically said that the totem religion was the way of kind of defining and characterizing and capturing their allegiance to their clans, right, and to their broader groups. All right, so he has the following kind of gloss on apparently instrumental action, right? So where, for example, there'd be a ritual of going into the forest and then turning over rocks in a certain way, and that was supposed to help the plants that they relied on to grow better in the coming year. All right, so Durkheim points out, look, this apparently instrumental religious action, it has a lot of the same florid trappings as non-instrumental group solidifying rituals. All right. Second, apparently instrumental religious actions, in fact, lack the purported causal efficacy, and kind of obviously so. All right, in his view. So his kind of inference to the best explanation is that the existence of apparently instrumental religious actions is that they are also, in fact, group solidifying rituals. So they're an instance of the same broader phenomenon. You have group solidifying rituals that are apparently instrumental and those that are not. All right. So what I'm going to use this to say is that a lot of the, apparently instrumental action, or at least some of the apparently instrumental action that is done on the part of religious extremists, are actually kind of the same in the same genre as group solidifying rituals. All right. So let's look at just one example of that, going back to the article that I quoted from in the beginning. So here's them attempting to dunk on me again. All right, it's not going to work. According to Pentagon intelligence documents, the 9/11 terrorists had shaved and doused themselves with flower water right before perpetrating the attacks, in expectation of the dark-eyed virgins in paradise. All right. So again, characterizing this sort of dousing with flower water as if it were some straightforward instrumental action, right? So one factually believes that smelling nicely of flower water will be more appealing to the dark-eyed virgin, and wanting to be appealing to the dark-eyed virgins, one douses one with flower water. Well, it's very plausible when you think, well, they knew that they were about to be incinerated, and so why shave and douse oneself with flower water? What's going on instead? All right, so kind of similar to what Durkheim would want to say, here's something about how I would gloss what that action was. All right, and this is from chapter 7 of my book on sacred values. So I say there, what has emerged is a preliminary action theory of symbolic sacred action. Symbolic sacred action is representational make-believe play, the execution of which is backed by the imperative force of sacred values. That which is sacralized is that which is a prop in such symbolic action, when that prop, according to the conventions of the play, is somehow linked to a revered supernatural entity. All right, so in short, and maybe plainer English, this sort of dousing with flower water is a ritual that unifies them as a group rather than plain instrumental action. And so that's what makes it symbolic action instead, right? But it's sacralized. So it's not unserious, but it's also not the same thing as instrumental action. Okay, so that kind of concludes my reasons for thinking that thesis 2 is correct, which is essentially saying that the religious credence model can be extended to extremists as well. All right, so wrapping things up, when we look at the original quote that I started out with, we see that they sort of gave the game away. So they used the phrase heartfelt beliefs. Now, think about it for a second. Would you use the phrase heartfelt beliefs to describe most of your factual beliefs? Do you have a heartfelt belief that Amsterdam is in the Netherlands, right? Do you have a heartfelt belief that rain comes from water? Do you have a heartfelt belief that not God, pointing to dogs have teeth, right? Do you have a heartfelt belief that cats have tails? Like, no, it's a funny phrase if you're actually describing factual beliefs. So what I really think is they were sort of intuitively sensing that there is a difference in cognitive attitude type here. And a phrase like heartfelt belief can refer to something like sacred values that constitute group identity, right? And something more in line with my theory than what they were trying to present it as, right? Which is sort of like these mere cognitive mistakes. All right, so wrapping things up, I want to appeal to Dimitris Tsikalatas's work on ritual. So great anthropologist, experimental anthropologist of rituals. He writes the following: highly fused individuals perceive threats to their group as personal affronts to themselves. When a fellow group member is threatened, they show emotional reactions similar to those they exhibit when their family members are threatened. They express more willingness to fight and die for their group. Imagistic rituals can result in this kind of supergroup, right? The kind of identity fusion with the group. So with that as kind of a useful gloss, I would want to say something like the following. Extremist behavior is often a blend between imagistic ritual and outgroup hostility, all right? Second, the religious credence model better explains the pretend play-like elements of this blend, like the dousing with flower water. And then third, the religious credence view coheres better with the existence of religious hypocrisy outside settings of sacred action, all right, which is something that is shared by extremists and non-extremists alike. So we end up actually in the end with a more unified picture of religious cognition than one that draws this cleavage. Thank you.